These are the 5 key takeaways, for me at least, that we've seen so far during the war between Israel and Hamas. Now, I'm recording this at 8 a.m. Central on October 9th, 2023. It's not intended as like a situation update of any sort, just because the situation on the ground is so fluid that inevitably it'll be different, and there will be updates between the time this is recorded and when it's published here in just a few hours. Now, I know just enough about the history of this conflict to recognize that overall I know very little about the history of this conflict. It's incredibly complex, incredibly nuanced. So I'm really going to try to focus in on the military aspects and what would apply, whether it's this war or any other. I'm sure you've heard people say that there's too much nuance to the war between Ukraine and Russia, and so much history there that it's hard for us to understand here in the United States. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is exponentially more complicated. It just is. This isn't something that you can spend a few hours, few days, or even a few weeks going down a rabbit hole and come out the other side with a full understanding of how this has and likely will play out. And lastly, I just want to say that there has been an absolute flood of information coming out. And not all of it accurate, not by a long shot. We've already seen video game footage and old pictures and videos shared as evidence of something that happened in the last day or two. When it comes to other conflicts, namely Russia and Ukraine or Afghanistan, Taliban, certain areas of the Middle East, I've studied some of those conflicts enough and those groups enough to have a general idea of what sources I can trust, which ones need to be double or triple checked, and then which ones to just completely ignore because they're entirely sensational. They get a bunch of headlines, but 9 times out of 10, it ends up not being very accurate. I am planning on providing some updates as it relates to this war sometime in the near future, but I just don't have those sources that I can really trust dialed in quite yet. Working on it, but it takes some time. I'm trying to be very deliberate because I really don't want to accidentally put out bad information. So the first element for me is that the element of surprise is still feasible in modern war, which shouldn't be a big shock, but I think we kind of veered too far in one direction at the start of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. If you remember back to when that was happening, the United States and NATO were releasing satellite imagery showing Russian forces massing on the border of Ukraine. We were putting out the units that were there, right? Essentially a signal to Russia of, you do not have the element of surprise. We see what you're doing. We know what you're getting ready to do. Of course, they went ahead with it anyways, but it kind of gave this impression that you can't mass a force like that on a border without being noticed. Now, that is one of the arguments, there's a lot of good reasons for this not to happen, but it's one of the arguments why there haven't been, attacks of that scale really since the opening days of the war. It's just, best case, you give away the element of surprise and you're noticed. Worst case, those troops massing for the attack come under enemy fire. Now, to be fair, what we've seen play out between Israel and Hamas is more akin to a terrorist attack than a major invasion launched by multiple divisions of the Russian military, right? We don't know the total number of Hamas and their affiliates that infiltrated Israel and took part in this action, but it was not in the hundreds of thousands, I think is safe to say. So it certainly was a smaller element. But still, Israel is very well known for having constant surveillance in and around Gaza. So the idea that Hamas was able to stage anything like this and pull it off and achieve that element of surprise, it's pretty notable. The second big part for me here is just the continued recognition that air defense is never perfect. I think here in the United States, over the last few decades, we've kind of gotten the impression that our technology is so advanced, our platforms are so sophisticated that nothing's going to be able to get through. It creates like a shield, and that's just not the case. Now, I do think some of that started to kind of unravel during the war in Ukraine, and more on that in a second, but Israel is very well known for having one of the most robust and sophisticated air defense networks in the world. Now, it's not clear how many of the Hamas rockets got through and how many actually struck their targets, and you would not expect Israel to release that information. It would give Hamas valuable intelligence. But just looking at the pictures and videos, it's pretty clear that a handful were able to make it through. Now, I think this recognition that air defense is a capability, not necessarily a guarantee, started to really come through during the war in Ukraine. I mean, we've seen countless Russian air defense systems that were, again, considered to be some of the best in the world, defeated by a lot of Ukrainian and Western-provided equipment. And there's been plenty of strikes all across Ukraine that, if air defense was perfect, would not have been able to make it through. And this is just one more kind of step in that direction of recognizing that air defense can shoot some things down, and it's a great asset, incredible technology, but it is not the end-all be-all. Just having air defense systems does not mean that your country or your target can never be hit. The next piece here is it looks like Israel is about to go big. This is not going to be a 2-3 day operation, not going to be a handful of drone strikes or bomb drops and call it a day. From all the reporting I've seen, it looks like Israel is conducting a pretty sizable mobilization, calling up the reserves. There's been a lot of videos and pictures showing military equipment on the move, and that all makes sense. You have to expect that the Israeli population is very much in favor of a large-scale operation moving into Gaza. It looks like that's in the works. Now, the other side of that is Hamas and their affiliated groups would have carried out these attacks. They would have known what's coming, right? They know that once they move into Israeli territory, it's very likely that the Israeli Defense Force moves into Gaza. So as this war continues to progress and when it looks like Israel moves into Gaza, expect that to be a very significant urban fight, right? Hamas is going to be prepared. It'd be very surprising if they kicked off this offensive action fully anticipating Israel to come into Gaza in the aftermath, and Hamas was not ready with defensive positions, stockpiles, and so on and so forth. The next item here that I'm kind of keeping an eye on is the idea that risk of escalation is very real in the short term. Now, there's already been some reports that Israel's been engaged with Hezbollah forces to the north, coming out of Lebanon, firing rockets, maybe some small arms fire there. That's not out of the realm of possibility. Completely fits that Hezbollah might try to take advantage of this. But the bigger question, I think, in a lot of people's mind is how Iran will factor into this entire conflict. Now, Iran has funded, I think it's 19 or 20 different groups that are overtly anti-Israel. They include Hamas. Palestinian Islamic Jihad is one of them. Hezbollah, of course, being another. Palestinian Islamic Jihad has organizations not just in Gaza and the West Bank, but also in Syria, Iraq, and of course in Lebanon. Now, the way Iran would likely escalate this, if they choose to do so, would not be with aircraft overhead or boots on the ground, but through their IRGC and their Quds Force, which is an organization that trains, equips, and kind of facilitates operations with groups all across the Middle East. It's a pretty effective organization, pretty effective how they've done that over the last few decades and been able to exert influence, all things considered. So if, or maybe when, we should say at this point, Israel pushes into Gaza, if Iran wanted to alleviate some of that pressure, they very well could have some of their very closely affiliated groups across the Middle East kick up attacks against Israeli and or Israeli allied targets to alleviate some of that pressure on Hamas. The last piece here is that we cannot underestimate the smaller, less equipped force. I mean, how many times have we made this mistake throughout history, right? I've already seen people talking about this, what looks to be an imminent IDF invasion of Gaza, saying that this signals the end of Hamas. They're going to cease to exist as an organization. Maybe that very well could be the outcome of this war, but it's not going to be fast, and it's certainly not going to be easy. I mean, the United States, we made this mistake in Vietnam, underestimating the threat that was North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. We underestimated the insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Russia then underestimated the Ukrainian people. We see this play out time and time again. Maybe this time it'll be different. And the IDF, a week from now, will complete all their objectives and Hamas will cease to exist. Who knows? We'll have to wait and see. I don't know that I bank on that. But that's all I got for now. If interested in learning more about this conflict, the war in Ukraine, or any other national security subjects, check out the sit reps I put out on Substack. The link is in the description below. It's 7 to 10 of the top national security stories each week, along with a few podcast recommendations. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.